So hi, everybody. Welcome. Great to see you all. Thank you for coming. I'm David Gersten. I'm the Director of Arts, Letters, and Numbers. And I want to welcome you all to this conversation today called Reimagining Education for a Climate-Altered World, Redesigning the Future. And we're holding this event in collaboration with the Global Citizenship Experience Lab School in Chicago. And I want to thank my dear friend, Cheryl Currizio, the director of the board of GCE, for bringing really such an important discussion to our exhibition in the City X Venice as part of the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale. As we know, the climate crisis we're all facing is clearly an existential threat to life on Earth. And I am convinced that if we are to reimagine this crisis, we must begin with reimagining education. Because at its core, this is a crisis of comprehension, it's a crisis of understanding. And how we find new ways to think about it will begin with new models of education. And this is why I'm so moved by the work that GCE is doing on this front. Embracing the United Nations SDGs as a core curriculum is really one of the great hopes for both education and for reimagining the future of our broader world. So I want to just take this moment to thank you all for the great work that you're doing. And I'll welcome and briefly introduce today's three speakers. Stephanie Leet is a PhD student in the Faculty of Education at McGill University. She has worked with GCE over the last decade as a teacher, curriculum designer, and trainer. Her current research examines the intersections among global citizenship, sustainable development, and climate change education, and how they can be holistically integrated into education systems. Welcome, Stephanie. Aaron Maureen Diagir teaches STEAM courses and is a curriculum designer at GCE Lab School. He is a Science Ambassador Fellow with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and specializes in game design and gamification. Welcome, Aaron. And Mena Savin is a member of GCE's class of 2021. They are currently in their first year at Columbia College in Chicago, studying animation and graphic design. So I really look forward to this conversation, and I want to thank you all for making this event possible.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. And thanks to Arts, Letters, and Numbers for partnering with us for this event. I also want to thank Greenbacker Capital for making this workshop series possible and for supporting GCE in developing the curriculum that we'll be sharing with you all at the end of this workshop. As David said, I'm currently a PhD student in Montreal, also known as Chochagi, and McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Ghanaian Gahaga, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. As we convene today to talk about sustainability, let us thank and recognize those who have for millennia served as stewards of the land from which we are each joining today.
And GC Lab School is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Fox, also call this area home.
Thank you. And we would love to know who's with us on the call today. This is going to be an interactive session, so we are going to ask you to be using the chat. A little bit later, we're going to be in breakout rooms, and we're going to be using a platform called Miro to brainstorm and draw some connections between ideas. So we want to make sure that everybody knows how to use the chat and just get warmed up a little bit. So if you could open up the chat and just introduce yourself, let us know your name and where you're joining from today. Welcome, Marcus. it's like, can't even keep up with these. Great, we've got a lot of people joining us today. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I know some of you were here 2 weeks ago when we did our first session about refueling the future, and I'm definitely seeing some new names here. So welcome to everyone. I don't want to do too much of a repeat of what we talked about the first session, but we will just do another brief introduction about GCE and the SDGs, and then we'll move on to thinking about how can we redesign the future, knowing that we are living in a climate altered world. And so that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. So welcome to everyone. And before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to make sure that you know a little bit more about who your hosts are today. David gave us a brief introduction, but Mena, could you just tell everybody a little bit more about GCE?
For sure. GCE is a private independent high school based in Chicago. It was founded in 2010, and it currently has 50 students that represent 32 neighborhoods and 6 suburbs in Chicago and the greater Illinois area. We are a very small community that focuses on community and partnerships, and we are given real-world experience and context to our courses, which makes them useful to us once we graduate. As an alumni, I can confirm this.
Great, thank you. So the name of the school is Global Citizenship Experience Lab School. And we talked about this a little bit in the last session about how we really think about what that name means and how do we define global citizenship. When we design curriculum, of course, we're an accredited school, so we think about what are the basic literacies that students need to learn, and we align with our state and national standards. But we also look at the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals really as global standards for education. So some of you might be very familiar with the SDGs, some of you a little bit less familiar, but these are 17 global priorities that the UN has identified as issues that we all need to be working to improve. And they've given us until 2030 to make big improvements in these different areas. And so today we're going to be focusing on SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities, and SDG 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. But as you'll see, the whole point of our conversation today is to really start seeing the connections between these different goals. And so we can't really be focusing on sustainable cities and communities without also thinking about clean water and thinking about affordable and clean energy. And so we really want to start building those connections today. Another thing that we talked about last week, and I want to put this in just as a reminder, is many of you probably heard about this report that came out over the summer from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they reiterated this idea that in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to cut our global carbon emissions in half by 2030. So at this point, that's just about 8 years away. And we need to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050. So we've got just under 30 years to reach net zero by 50. And so that means that all of our man-made greenhouse gas emissions need to be removed from the atmosphere through reduction measures and also through natural and artificial sinks. And sinks are things that absorb carbon. So, rainforests are natural carbon sinks. That's an example of a natural carbon sink, but we are also developing artificial carbon sinks to figure out how to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we've got a big task ahead of us. There's a lot to do. And so I want to take a moment to just think about what does that world look like? It's just under 30 years away. We're thinking about the year 2050. So what is the world going to be like in that year? Think about where are people going to live and work? How will those things look different? What about food? How are we growing food? What are we eating? How are we transporting it? How are we getting around? What do our cities look like? What do our suburbs look like? How are people getting from one place to another? What are we wearing? How are things made? What stuff are we using in the year 2050? And how are we producing it? What is it produced from? And also, how are we powering society? So I want you to think about these prompts, and I'll give you a few minutes. If you happen to have a piece of paper next to you, you're welcome to sketch something out or make some notes. Or if you want to use the chat, you can write your ideas there. If you want to just close your eyes for a few minutes and imagine what the world looks like in 2050, I want to give you some time to think about that, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. And then we're going to come back to that later in the session. So I'm just going to be quiet for about 2 minutes as you make notes, draw pictures, fill up the chat, thinking about what the world looks like in 2050. Great, so I'm starting to see some ideas in the chat. Extensive high efficiency public transportation systems, local power. Yes, water viewed as a precious commodity. Everyone vegetarian. Great. Something between Westworld and The Wire. Good. Thank you for sharing these. And you're going to have a chance to, yes, more green for sure. Coming back to that idea of carbon sinks. Oh, this is great. And I love that we're generating all these ideas, and you're definitely going to have a chance to share these in small group discussions and map out the connections between some of these ideas. But I want to, and keep filling up the chat, please. But we're gonna move on in terms of our conversation, thinking about like what are the main things that we need to transform? What are the major industries that we really need to rethink in order to make this transition? This is just a graph of the industries that emit the most greenhouse gases. So we have electricity and heat production, and I would add cooling to that as well. We have agriculture, forests, and other land uses. Our agriculture systems are big carbon producers. Our buildings, the way, not just the way we run buildings, but the way we construct buildings as well. We have transportation and industry. So that it could mean manufacturing. Where are we getting our materials from? How are we producing our goods? And so these are like 5 really major transitions that we need to make in the next less than 30 years. I don't want to scare you with this graph or with this diagram, but this is just to show an example of how complicated these transitions can be. So this is a graph that shows the transition from being a predominantly horse-powered society to being a predominantly automobile-powered society. And I know that you can't read all the fine print. It's not very clear, but I want you to really just focus on the arrows, which represent the connections between all these different parts and different players and different events. So for example, we have in the middle here, we have what we call the regime or a system. So these are networks and groups that are bound by norms and rules that become entrenched. Okay, so right now we are definitely entrenched in an automobile, single car society right now. So this is what's happening at our regime level, at our system level in this example. So how did we get there? Well, there were lots of small things that happened at the individual or small scale innovation level in terms of developments in electricity and how trams were developed, and the evolution of bicycles and how bicycles evolved. But at the same time, there were all these things happening like immigration and movement from rural areas into urban areas. And because of that, having a horse-powered society that produced quite a bit of waste, we'll say, it just wasn't feasible to keep cities running on horsepower. There was a lot of manure piling up. And so innovations needed to happen because of these big, broad landscape movements that were out of any one individual's control. And so I don't want you to get caught up too much in the exact details of what's written here, but really just to see the movement of all these different pieces that are moving in one direction in order to transform a system. And so this took about 60 years to make this transition. And now we have about 30 years in order to transition some of these other industries. And so that's what we really want to be thinking about today is what are all the different things that need to happen in order to transition these industries to be more sustainable. And we have a guest today who's going to help us think through some of the things that are already happening. We are joined today by Eli Greenberg, who is the principal at Greenbacker Labs. And Greenbacker Labs provides capital and strategic business planning to enterprises creating new opportunities in sustainable infrastructure at the building, community, and industrial level. And so Eli, are you with us?
I am. I hope everyone can hear me.
Great. Yes, we can hear you just fine. Welcome. I will go ahead and get started on your slideshow.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's great to be here. Great to be chatting with everyone about this. Just by way of background, so you know a little bit more about me. I'm a chemical engineer by way of schooling, and spent most of my career in the water, wastewater sector. I also worked on solar a little bit, and fuel cells as well. And now I'm at Greenbacker. So today I'm going to talk about redesigning the future, and try to answer the two questions of how will we design the future, and to talk a little bit about systems and how they impact design and engineering to mitigate climate change. You'll notice a picture on the right side. If we were in a group of people, I might ask you what this is, but in the interest of time, I'll tell you, and this is going to come back around at the end of my slides, but it's one of the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge being built in the 1880s. And I think this is fitting because I think when we think about infrastructure and design for the future, part of that has to do with modularity and how do we reuse what we have, and we'll look at some examples of that. But we can go on to the next slide. So before we talk about the how, obviously, why do we need to redesign the future? And I think we've talked a little bit about this so far, and you're probably all aware. But over the next 20, 30 years, we're going to have more urbanization of the world, more people in cities, which puts more stress on all of our systems, whether it's transportation, energy, water, communications, and so forth. So how do we design them in a way that they are integrated, they work with one another, and they present a livable world for everyone? And next slide. So I think the next question is what is design? And I like to boil this down, and this is a great quote I found from Kenya Hara, who's a Japanese designer. But essentially, he says that design lies in the process of finding a problem and trying to solve it for as many people as possible. And in doing so, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need new creations and new innovations, but how do you make something that you already have just work better? And I think there's sometimes a common misconception when you think about design that you have to be an engineer or an architect or an urban planner or have some specialized knowledge. But the reality is we all have skills to be a designer because we all see problems in our own life and we all see different ways of solving them. And so I think that there's an opportunity for everyone to participate in the design process so that you create a better community all around. So I just want to highlight real quick, what are the things that we need to redesign? And so, energy, water, health and safety, transportation, communication, education, all of these systems are integrated. You often hear people talk about the energy, water, food nexus, for example, where you need water to, previously to cool thermoelectric power plants, which is a reason why solar and wind is so great because it keeps water in the ground. You also need water for agriculture. So there are other systems like vertical farming, high-tech greenhouse farming that use 90% less water. There's drip irrigation technologies that you use less water for farming. Then obviously this connected to transportation because how do you get food to market and so forth. And so, really all of the systems we have are integrated. And I think, traditionally we've sort of thought about these in silos where, people work on water and wastewater, people work on energy, people work on transportation, but in reality, all of these systems are integrated and they all play off of each other. And go over to the next slide. And so I don't want to get too off tangent, but when we think about climate change and resiliency and what do we need to redesign for the future, this is a report card from the American Society of Civil Engineers, kind of highlighting where we are, unfortunately, with a lot of our infrastructure. And so there's obviously, you look at these scores, and this is not a very good report card. So there's opportunities everywhere for improvement, for redesigning the systems around us to make them more resilient to climate change and improving them for everyone. And oftentimes, there's a lot of interplay between these. If you look at water and wastewater, wastewater just used to be about treating wastewater and being able to discharge it. And now people look at wastewater and say, wow, there's actually a lot of nutrients in wastewater that we can recover, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and then actually use those, back in the agricultural sector or, as commodities elsewhere, or generate power from anaerobic digestion processes when you break down the solids that are in wastewater as opposed to just, burning them off or flaring them. Go to the next slide. So I think if we talk about how will we redesign the future, I would sort of boil it down to two parts. And one is process and the second is modularity. So having a process that considers the purpose, the stakeholders, the trade-offs, costs, who are you designing for? What are they going to do with it? Why are we redesigning something? Does it have to be redesigned? Who are the people, communities that are involved? Who's going to be impacted? What are the trade-offs and so forth of whatever the project is? Can you do one thing? Can you do two things? Can you do three things? Is there some type of trade-off you have to think about? And then the second part is modularity, in the extent that what you build now may not be what we need in 20 years or 30 years or 100 years. And so is it designed in such a way that it could change? And it being a bridge, a park, a wastewater treatment plant. If populations move and you have modular wastewater treatment plants, could you take them apart and relocate them to different areas? Similar thing with greenhouse farming. Could you have the modular greenhouse on a roof that grows food for a period of time and then maybe it moves, or you build above it, or you build housing above the existing structures. So thinking about ways that infrastructure could be modular, and especially as it relates to climate risks. We talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius, and there's lots of models about what happens, but there's also a little bit of ambiguity because we don't know exactly. And so if you lift up a structure 10 feet, is that enough, or are you going to have to lift it up more? So the extent that you could think about modularity is very important. And go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the design process over the next few slides. So this is something called the McLeamy curve, and there's a couple curves with similar names, but essentially what it talks about is through the design process, you have the ultimate amount of flexibility when you start, and changes don't cost a lot of money. But by the time you get to the end of the process and you've actually built something, it's obviously very expensive to change. And so I think when we think about systems integration and how do we work together to design something, it's important that you have all the way on the left side, that you have input from everyone in the conceptual design phase, and you kind of have an integrated planning approach of how is whatever you're building going to impact the communities around you. What's the impact going to be on energy, water, transportation, communication, et cetera. And as you move through this process and you get into schematic design and the design development, that's when the design really takes shape. And maybe you're having to make trade-offs, and you're having to say, well, maybe the road only needs to have 2 lanes. It doesn't really need to have 4 lanes. Or there's different ways that you could do package delivery, and so you can start to shape the design so that you're kind of hitting the needs of all the stakeholders involved. And then you reach a point where you are actually bidding the design and building it, and taking the project from start to finish. I'm gonna go to the next slide. And I think this is another question that you have when you think about what is the ideal design. So there's an interplay between cost and safety and climate risk. And I put climate risk in a question mark there because I think we certainly know there's a risk. What exactly that severity is in some places we don't know, and it may just be more severe than we think it's going to be. But then the question is, is spending more money going to reduce that climate risk? And what is the optimum safety level? And when I say cost, it's not just financial costs. There's also opportunity costs, accessibility costs. When you look at changing the height of infrastructure, for example, does that create accessibility concerns, and so forth? And so I think there's all these different trade-offs and interplays that you have to think about. Next slide. So I mentioned system considerations a few minutes ago, and there's you don't have to read all of these, but you can see there's an interplay between physical systems. We talked about energy, water, food, et cetera, as well as the cultural and the social impacts of what we're doing, and how does design affect the community around you? How does it affect individual people and how they're interacting with it? I think there's a number of stakeholders and thoughts and kind of boxes you need to think about as you go through the process. You can't just sort of think in silos about say transportation, but it's how does transportation affect everyone else and everything around you. So I want to talk about a couple quick examples. I know I don't have much more time left, but just 2 things to think about in terms of modularity. So this is an example on the left of a schematic of building above existing apartment buildings. I think about this in New York City where I live, where there's a housing crisis, and this is true in a lot of places in the country. But how do you take new materials, carbon fibers, 3D printing, and just build above existing buildings, right? You've got space, but of course, to build above them means that you have additional impacts on water, wastewater. You're putting more people in a place, and you need to have more wastewater treatment to make sure that everyone has adequate sanitation, as an example. On the right side, this is the North River wastewater treatment plant in New York, where on the bottom is a treatment plant. You don't actually see it, but above it, they built a huge park with swimming pools and athletic fields. And they could have left it uncovered, and you just would have seen an ugly wastewater treatment plant. But there's another way to reutilize space, so it has more benefit for the community around you. Next slide. And so then this takes us sort of full circle to the Brooklyn Bridge example, where the Brooklyn Bridge was originally built in the 1880s to carry horses and trolleys. And then on the left side, you see where that went from horses and trolleys to cars and trolleys, to a period in the middle, and I don't have a picture, but it was all cars. And now on the right side, one of the lanes is going to be turned into a bike lane, right? And so you can take an existing piece of infrastructure and just modify it and make it modular so that it fits the needs of of the times we live in and make it more resilient to climate change. And then my last slide, before we questions, I'll just show you this example, which is a park on the left side in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And most of the year, it's just a basketball court surrounded by concrete bleachers, but it also doubles effectively as a bowl. So in a rain event, excess rainwater can flow into this bowl, and that prevents flooding in the surrounding community. And then when the weather's nice, you can drain the water out of it. And so there's different ways that you can take one piece of infrastructure, in this case a park, and reuse it in different ways. And so I think, as you think about, redesigning the future, think about the process, think about how to make it modular. And I think you'll come up with some great solutions for tackling climate change. So with that, happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Eli. That was really interesting. I saw definitely some reactions to that report card that you showed. And I want to give everybody a chance to ask some questions if you have them for Eli, either by using the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question directly.
How do you think that we as a singular person can help instill these changes in infrastructure and construction, since, I would not know where to start with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, I would say at the community level, I don't know if there's a community board where you live. In New York City, we've got community boards, and they're great places to bring suggestions, bring ideas, talk to people. There's different committees, like we've got a park across the street from my house that's overgrown. And so I think starting at the community level, talking to people is probably the best place to start. As well as, I tell everyone to get involved in engineering and science, because I think it's a great place to have an impact. So.
We have a question from Cheryl. Which areas of design are top priorities for Greenbacker?
Yeah, so Greenbacker is very focused on solar. I mean, I'd say all sustainable infrastructure, but primarily solar, wind. And then I spend a lot of time thinking about energy efficiency. I think there's a lot of gains to be had by making buildings and structures more energy efficient, and we can actually reduce the power consumption of those structures.
A quick question: in light of the urgency of all of this, is there a concern around equity and our need to do this in a democratic process? How do you balance the need to get things done and hear everybody and adhere to our democracy, which is messy and takes a long time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think in a lot of cases, if you go back to the report card, a lot of the infrastructure is, if you look at water and wastewater treatment plants, some of these upgrades can sort of happen in place. I think when you think about transportation, I think it's just about having a conversation. And you're right, it's messy, it takes time. But I see that happening in New York. You look at the bike lane on the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, it took years, but I think that's the process. But I think you sort of have to go through that so that everyone feels part of it, and we do what's in the best interest of the community as a whole.
Thank you. We have another question from Homa. What is your suggestion for 2 immediate actions on personal level to change things?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say, thinking about, water and energy. So sort of, where do you get your energy from? Can you, engage in some type of community solar program where, on your energy bill, you can get, you can participate in community solar, so you get renewable electrons delivered to your house. And I think, and also finding ways to use less water is a big one, because there's a lot of energy related to water transportation, water treatment, as well as heating water. We spend probably 30% or more of our energy just heating water for showers and so forth. So I think water and energy are 2 places to focus.
Thank you so much. That was the last question that I saw. But I really, really appreciate you giving us this overview of especially the idea of the modularity of construction. That wasn't something that I had thought of before, of how do we use our existing infrastructure and make it higher capacity, make it more adaptable to changes that we don't really know what's ahead for us. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming to talk with us today, and you're welcome to stay and participate in the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's start thinking about, I think Eli said that, like, we don't know what's coming, and we haven't figured everything out. We know we have this idea of a 2050 goal, but there's lots of different pathways that we could take in order to get there. And we really need, like, everybody's brains working on this, no matter what angle you're coming at this from. So we want to come back to this question of what is our vision for 2050, and how do we overcome the 5 challenges in order to achieve that vision. Everybody at the beginning of this session wrote down a few notes, or you drew some pictures thinking about 2050 and what it might look like. But how do we really think about these different sectors and the connections between them, and what are the first steps that we take? So I'll remind you again of this interplay of different things happening. Eli talked about, at the landscape level here, we have increased urbanization, right? We have more people that are moving from rural areas, moving into cities. So what does that mean, and how does that influence what's happening at this sort of regime or systems level? How does that impact the systems that we already have in place? And what kinds of small scale innovations do we need to be responding so that we can start moving in a more sustainable direction? So what we want to do is give you all a chance to share some of the ideas that you have, bounce ideas off of each other, and start thinking about these different levels. And if you were at our last session, you got to experiment and play around a little bit with a Miro board. And so we're going to be working again in a Miro board, and we have different boards set up for each group that we're going to break you into breakout rooms in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the Miro board and that you know what you're going to be working on. So when you get into your group, you will have a board that you can visit. That'll be your workspace. Depending on your breakout group number, you'll have your own individual workspace. And we want you to work through these questions here. So first, you're going to introduce yourselves and share your visions for 2050. So what do you imagine agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, buildings, and electricity industries look like in 2050? And you're going to use this blue space to start populating your ideas. So Mena, and I don't know if Aaron is here as well, but maybe we could put down,
thank you.
Great, welcome. Maybe we could put down a few ideas that we had in our own brainstorm. So we're thinking here of, what do our systems look like in 2050? And we're going to use sticky notes here. So you just go over to the left panel here and grab one of these sticky notes. I was thinking about transportation. So I'm going to grab a pink sticky note to represent transportation. So I think we have all electric vehicles. Aaron, do you have any ideas for 2050?
Yeah, so the thing that I was thinking was about ride sharing and what that looks like in the future. What does it mean to have a vehicle?
Interesting. Yeah, that's not just ride sharing, but what does it mean to have a vehicle? Who has a vehicle? What kind of vehicle are they? Mena, what do you have here? You have something for agriculture?
Yeah, I think by 2050, we're going to reduce our consumption of meat products immensely. I wouldn't ask everyone to become, vegetarian, because some people have dietary reasons why they can't. But I think just the reduction of the scale that we have for agriculture to feed animals just needs to go down.
Great. Thank you to you both. So what are some things that would need to happen? This is the systems level that we're talking about here. What are some things that would need to happen in order for us to realize this vision? And so I'm going to put another Post-it note here, another sticky note. So I think we need, I'm not an expert in this, I don't know where we are, but we need better batteries in order to make our cars last longer or go further without charging. So I'm going to get really fancy here, and I'm going to go over and I'm going to grab an arrow that shows the connection between this and this. So we need someone to invent these longer lasting batteries and increase storage capacity in order to move to an all electric vehicle society. Menna, what did you add here?
I said we should make meat alternatives tastier and more appetizing. I feel like a lot of people are maybe put off by things like tofu because it looks different from what we're used to eating for meat.
Okay, and there's different companies that are working on that right now. How do we produce artificial meats? How do we make meat substitutes more tasty and appetizing? Erin, I saw that you added something up here at the landscape level. So remember, these are things that are a little bit out of our control, but they influence the movement in a certain direction. So you put, Erin, can you share what you wrote up here?
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you were saying about having all of these electrical vehicles, and I was comparing that to the vehicle ownership. And I think that one of the things that would be prohibitive for everybody having electrical vehicles is the cost of the battery specifically. And so I think that there's a connection between those two. If we wanted to have everybody have electric vehicles, then sharing or redefining what ownership of a vehicle could be a way of getting there, but that price of batteries is a hurdle that's in the way.
Right. Great, thank you. So this is what we're going to ask you to do in your groups. So you are going to start by populating this blue area with your visions for 2050, and then start thinking about what needs to happen. What are some things that we might have control over, or that individual companies or consumers or individual societies might have control over, that kind of influence our movement towards this vision. And then what are some things that could be happening at the landscape level, whether it's migration, whether it's climate events that also are pushing us into a certain direction. And if you have time, I would really love you to think about this last prompt here, which is, where do you fit into all this? After you've created your board with your group members, find a purple sticky note and figure out what is your contribution to all of this? We need all hands on deck in order to make this transition. So no matter how big or small your contribution is, find a place where you think that you can fit in and make a contribution somewhere. So I want to open it up before we move into our breakout rooms. Are there any questions? First of all, have we put access to the Miro board in the chat? I know it went out in an email, but let's make sure that we have a link to the Miro board in the chat so everybody can access that. So that's your link. If you click on Miro, it's going to open up in a new window. And you can zoom in and out by using, if you have a trackpad, you can use 2 fingers to zoom in and out and to move around the board. So you will be able to see our entire presentation is on this board. And soon you're going to move into a breakout room. And so you are going to go to the board number that corresponds to the group number that you enter. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anyone who's unable to access Miro? Okay, we're going to make sure that once we get into breakout rooms, Erin, Menna, Marcus, and I are going to be moving around to make sure that you're able to figure this out. sometimes it can be really self-explanatory, and other times with different tabs open, it can be a little bit confusing, and depending on what kind of computer you have. So let's go ahead and get started with these breakout rooms.
So is there, maybe I could just pick one of them. Let's say for living, yes, for living and working, I basically said cities, increase density. And the proximity of work and home becoming shorter and more condensed. Increased density.
Great.
Oh, you
thank
like increased density. That's interesting.
For efficiency purposes, for the purpose of
Yes, yes. Sure.
making us use fewer resources per person.
Yes, very well said. I'd like to expand on that. Increased density with a green space, for rooftop level green space, so people can cultivate gardening, using natural resources for produce and things along those lines.
Excellent. Yep.
All right, I'm going to put urban gardens on there.
Yes, urban gardens, that's exactly right.
My app seems to be lagging just a little bit, but we'll get there. And also, I don't want the technology to be a hindrance of the conversation. So if it gets to the point where we're just rolling with it, that's okay too.
Yeah, but it's similar to the urban cities and things along those lines. I thought that mass transit, using renewable energy, that's accessible to all, that would also help. And in the scenario that we can't be super dense, the mass transit is fast and efficient, so it's not a time suck on people's time and energy to get to where they need to go. I think that's a challenge that a lot of people have, at least now that they're realizing.
Absolutely. So I see that you're writing fast transit. I'm going to similarly write limited by transit accessibility and options and things like that. I was actually having a conversation with one of my friends just yesterday about how the difference between where he lives and I live, he has to own a car. He couldn't imagine my life without a car, just biking or taking a train. And I used to live there as well. It's a different world.
Yeah. I have a car and it just sits in the garage not being used because I don't need to use it.
I know many people like that.
But wait,
and I feel like that's location specific, right?
Where does everyone live in this group? I'm not really sure what your backgrounds are, except for Aaron.
I'm on the near south side of Chicago.
Okay. I'm in New York, but I'm in Providence 3 days a week.
Ooh, I love Providence.
I live in Chicago. I live in the Lincoln Park area, but I go into the downtown space and I walk. I don't even take public transportation.
So what is your interest in being in this seminar?
I sit on the GC board.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Rupal and I both sit on the board.
Okay. All right. And
Yeah.
then there's someone named Jerry who's here. I'm curious who Jerry is.
Jerry?
I see the name Jerry on the Zoom board. Doesn't have a photograph.
Oh. I don't know who that is. I haven't, maybe he's on mute or something because he's
He is
not
on mute.
talking, right?
He is on mute.
Yeah. I don't
It
know.
has the default black screen.
I'm not familiar with Jerry either.
Yeah, me neither.
So
But in
can I just,
yeah.
wait, can I just say a few things that I think are kind of interesting about Aaron's discussion earlier?
Mm-hmm.
And that's that I teach something called design at an art school, Rhode Island School of Design. And that word is a very general word. So in a sense, I was really fascinated to find the specificity in your worlds. And what I think is really interesting is the necessity for groups of people to come together. And the one slide I really thought was fascinating is to see the amount of potential at the beginning of something, but the complexity as you go along to fine tune it to fit the whatever are your restrictions and your goals. And that's not unlike what you have. I'm a painter, and it's not unlike finishing a piece of artwork. The closer you get to the end, like a chess game, the more difficult it is. And the one thing that I want to bring into my students, and I have had a climate change project for every semester where they have to do a project that's based on it. It's a physical thing, but they have to do the research and everything. But I think it's really so critical that everyone knows how important working in a group is, because there's no ivory towers for people to escape to. And I think that idea is, the ivory tower is a little bit perpetuated by either those who can afford it or were encouraged to do their own thing, or the ones that have gone off the grid and have, like, for hell or high water, I'm going to do this. And those are getting fewer and fewer, I would hope, because it's not possible without kind of a cooperative atmosphere to make this happen. And so my one big question underlying all of these things I see is what societal things will change because there's an incentive to make them change.
Yes.
And kind of want to elaborate on what Marty was saying. I'm a little bit concerned, but understand that particularly in America, we have a very individualistic culture. We pride individualism often over collective. I guess the notion is sometimes everybody looking out for themselves has a net result and improved benefits for everybody, but I'm not always convinced that's the case. And there are many circumstances where you almost need to impose collective responsibility on everybody. So
that's
at the highest level, what's that called? The social, economic, political component, the green part. I'm concerned that America will have a hard time, and this pandemic is a perfect example of it, of our inability to act individually for the benefit of the collective. I almost wish, sometimes I wish we had kind of benign dictatorship like Singapore, and we could just impose this stuff. As long as the dictator's a good person, we'd be all set. But of course, that's fraught with challenges, because most of the time people who want to become dictator are not good people. But I just want America's individualism.
Yeah.
Yes.
Country.
It kills me, you know. Yeah.
So a country
that
I think is of interest to me is the Netherlands. And I think they've had to be so collective for hundreds of years to get anything accomplished. And I still see that they're doing that. I've seen a few good climate films, one called Normal is Over or something like that. And I'm really fascinated that they must get it together as a group And I don't know how to live there would be otherwise, but I think it's fascinating. There is somebody trying it.
Right.
So I do a lot of game design, game work, and this makes me think of like different styles of gaming. And there's competitive games, everybody versus everybody, and you're trying to get to the finish first or whatever it happens to be. But there's a relatively new style of board gaming called cooperative, and it's everybody versus the board, whatever it happens to be. And it's a different mindset entirely. And I think that the challenge in that realm, it's niche, but training your players to think differently, because it's a different type of thinking that it takes to win that sort of a game. And that to me is the same strategy that we're facing here. Is like, we've been in a situation where for the majority of the world, you fight for whatever you can get, or you argue for your own policies that work. Everybody else be damned. And then we're going to have to restructure not just our own desires or what our car looks like, but how we actually think, how we approach the problems. And that's tough.
Hear, hear. How we define success. It's not just us.
But what incentive is going to make
Good question.
people want to do that? This is where I feel depressed. I feel incredibly optimistic knowing young people who are willing to go in these positive directions. But I don't know how your average upper middle class person is going to go beyond, well, let's put the recycling things there and we take them out to the curb so that the paper can be recycled. It's like, this is a tiny, tiny thing. Are they going to give up 20% of their lifestyle? No.
Right. Well, we need innovation so that we can, to some degree, consume less and still enjoy the same benefits we have today. That's part of it.
Yeah.
And the other is, I think we have to increase the cost of individualism, increase the cost of doing something that benefits me, but overwhelmingly harms others. And I'm talking about policies, taxations. I don't know. The whole mantra of I can do whatever I want is, of course, never been truthful in America, because we restrict human rights on all kinds of levels if it's known to harm others. But people seem to spout it all the time. I'm an American, I'm a free person, I can do whatever I want. Well, no, you never could. And let's make the cost of thinking that way high. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think we need to change the concept of instant gratification, because I don't think that's where we are in this world, and that's why people consume as much as they do. There's so many components of that, right? And they're looking at what their current state is and not being future. They're not thinking about the future. And I think about the pandemic and how there's people who don't want to go into the office because they're just so used to their world, but they don't understand that there's other livelihoods at stake here. It's not only about them, you know what I mean? But so that's the part that I struggle with.
But I do think there has to be innovation, and maybe this is going to take too long. But innovation where we don't ask humans to make great sacrifices, but we have improved outcomes. Where it's easier to recycle, where more stuff is in transportation is safe and easily available, and mass transportation I'm talking about here. So I just talk about, I have a background in economics, and I just think about incentives and costs that people have to bear. And I would like to see a lot of these external costs borne on the people that create them. It's not obvious how I do that, but that's the concept I want to execute.
So where are we on our board?
Well, I've added a new color to it. and that's the red ones. And I've put those as essentially major problems and hurdles in the way, because it seems like we can identify those too. And while we might not have the solutions, Marty, you were talking about like having these group conversations, these group think, where if I can identify the problem, but you can identify one step closer to the solution, that different perspective and being able to see things from different points of view is a step.
Yeah, it is, right. Do you know this social scientist, Paul Piff from California? There was a TED Talk that he gave, I don't know, must be like 5 years old now, on it said, "Does money make you mean?" And it's really about a lot of different studies that he and his team did to try to prove that there's a certain group that are ego bent, and like people crossing the street. They put a person to cross the street in Berkeley, and it was the cars that were the biggest and fanciest didn't stop. And the ones that were smaller and older, they were more empathetic. But at the end of this thing, which is absolutely fascinating, it's not long, they try to retrain people by sensitizing certain groups. And so it actually is encouraging that if given an opportunity for people to get to their own place of empathy, that they can go, oh, I didn't realize that.
It's a learned behavior then.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
and so
that
new behaviors can be learned. Sorry to cut you off, Ripple.
no, that's exactly right. I was thinking the same thing around the learned behavior. There is, in my opinion, we have to get better aware of who we are as individuals, like really that whole concept of meditation and really knowing yourself, because that will help you understand how you can help society at large. So that's one thing that I think is very, very important, because people become selfish when they think about like external things. And if they really kind of dug deep into who they were. So that's one of the things that I think is in our individual power to change, right? And to influence, right? Is self-reflection and self-awareness and how that impacts, our society. I don't know if I think that's what I would like to see on the board for 2050, right? That people really understand who they are. I don't know. Like,
And
Dang, other people had to be kicked out. Hope we didn't cut your conversations.
Those conversations are running along. That's awesome.
I kept thinking, okay, I'll give one more minute. I still see the little things zooming around the Miro board. So I hope that everyone was able to figure out Miro, or had someone in your group who was able to guide you in that process a little bit, or at least you had an interesting conversation and forgot about the Miro board. That's okay too.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for being room number one's
Sure.
facilitator.
No problem. So we've been sitting for an hour and 15 minutes. So I want to take like 3 minutes of quiet to, if you want to turn off your camera, stand up and stretch. And also just like scroll through these boards. If you've figured out how to navigate Miro, you can look at what other groups talked about by checking out their sticky notes. And if you would like to comment on someone's board, you can just leave a yellow note there and ask them a question, or agree with something, or say, that sounds like a cool idea. So let's take about 3 minutes to do that, but please feel free to, yes, go ahead.
What color should our responses be in?
Yellow. Please use a yellow sticky note. If you can figure out how to do different colored sticky notes, choose a yellow sticky note and comment on someone else's board. But also, if you want to use this as an opportunity to just like stand up, move around a little bit, you can do that too. we'll come back in, let's say 2 minutes. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share again so that we can zoom in a little bit closer. Is there anybody, I see a few yellow Post-it notes. Is there anybody who would like to comment on someone else's board and what you saw there? Maybe we'll start zooming in on group 2 because I see 2 yellow sticky notes here.
Yeah, this is Cheryl. I think, you know, as our group was talking, and then I think I put this one first sticky note on here, is I think we've got to make this whole one, it's like get that report card in front of more people, but we've got to make it trendy, right? We've got to make this climate innovation a trendy thing that people want. And how we do that in each of these different areas, I'm not sure, but it's that kind of believability that you're making a difference.
Right.
Similar to that, a conversation come up at the very end of our chat where we were just thinking about, from an economic perspective, how do you incentivize? And so that trendiness, I think, lines up real nicely. Like, we have to make it easy. We have to make it desirable to get into this realm.
Yeah, and go ahead.
I agree with that. And group 3 had an interesting post-it on their board. Wind turbines can be painted by communities to feel more familiar. What the concept or what the what public art will look like, what role public art will have in 30 years in this process of getting to this point, I think is fascinating to me when I think about what we treat as cultural anthropology now, and you know, art across the country and across the world. What power does it have? What tools can we use from it to help propel this process?
Yeah, the thing.
Oh, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was just working on it this morning. There's 2 different exhibitions coming through Chicago that's all about art and alignment with the SDGs and sustainability. And one of the ones is they're in a mobile van that's going around the city. And it's in a partnership with artists from around the world, with a big contingent from Denmark. And I'm just like, wow. I mean, people are doing crazy things, and it's interesting to see art leading the movement, especially when, you know, if you talk to most people, they have no idea what the SDGs are in the States. If you go to Europe, everybody knows what they are. So it's interesting to see the artists, and that will make things trendy then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was gonna say the conversation that led to this was that some people can feel like wind turbines or solar panels are alien. You know, they're like, I don't want it in my backyard. It doesn't look nice. But I think, you know, the community coming together and putting their own spin on it might make it more familiar and easier to incorporate in places.
Thank you. I also see some purple Post-it notes. Purple Post-it notes are supposed to be initiatives, personal initiatives or personal contributions that we can make. Does anybody want to talk about a purple Post-it note?
One thing that came up early for us is the value of having conversations that are outside of our own experience and being able to see different points of view. Conversations like this, taking these out and meeting people who don't even share our same biases or expectations, but that those conversations are essential to moving forward in this dialogue. And so I guess the personal responsibility is to be in those conversations, to do things like this and taking them into our communities.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the ones that came up in our group, oh, you just moved away.
Sorry. I was going to go to group 1. Go ahead.
See, yeah, it was to hold events that are easily accessed by public transport. I see a lot of events in like high school and college are easily accessible through public transit, but adult things like C2E2 and just, events that are more fancy are not accessible through public transport. And I think that needs to be changed.
Right. I don't know if anybody from my group wants to share, but I was just thinking about this idea of, thinking about issues from different perspectives and making sure that different voices are at the table. And one of the things we talked about is incorporating more Indigenous knowledge and practices into all these different sectors, because a lot of the things that we are trying to figure out, we already know how to do, or someone knows how to do. It's been done before. So how can we make sure that we are learning from the knowledge that we already have? And we talked about education, of course, as playing a major role in that, and really trying to, like, it's not just coming up with solutions, but it's like a whole new worldview and it's a paradigm shift that we need to make so that we can even start seeing outside of the practices and the systems that we are so accustomed to. It's difficult to imagine outside of them. Is there anybody from group one that wanted to build on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll add, one of the points we were talking about, and it's a little difficult to convey very briefly, but I'm going to. One of the things that I spend a fair amount of time working on is looking at, say, the last 1,000 years of market function, financial instruments, how they've evolved from the birth of modern corporations, modern banking, etc. And one of the observations that I could briefly make is that I think if you study that history closely and look at many, many forms of risk distribution over the last 1,000 years, you can realize that some of the greatest risks we face today, climate crisis as one example, and there are many, many others, they can be recognized as the accumulation of previous forms of risk distribution. So, over the centuries, there have always been an attempt to distribute risk or mitigate risk. And that has generated incredible compression of risk, into our time. So you end up in a kind of paradox, which is it's so ingrained in the West, the reflex to generate yet another form of risk distribution, another form of mitigating the crisis according to the terms that we understand risk distribution to be today. But the point of embracing voices that are not at the table, Indigenous is an important example. I would argue that probably the knowledge that we may need very likely lives in the poorest 2 to 3 billion people on Earth who are basically not heard. And that's part of the crisis we face, is that the megaphone of the West is so loud that the poorest 2 to 3 billion people on Earth that very likely still have temporalities that are linked to, that predate the forms of risk distribution I'm describing, that very likely there is knowledge there that we can't even imagine. It doesn't fall into the sort of, the folk old way of doing things and all these sort of superficial visions of what that knowledge is. We actually need the knowledge. and so the gesture to be, how can we construct systems or construct communication where we can learn from the people who sadly enough have the least.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other final thoughts about these boards or something that you saw on someone else's board?
I just wanted to say, it's not specifically about the boards, but one of the issues that came up in our room was this issue of mistrust in the process of recycling. And if something as huge as recycling, which is part of every nation's kind of dealing with this issue, if we could put our trust in it, the rate that we would recycle would increase tremendously. In Iran, there are children that go to the garbage and they take out what is recyclable and they sell it. So there is truly, up to that point of that selling part, it's so streamlined because these kids are going to get anything out of the garbage that's recyclable. And it's made me to be so much more OCD about my garbage than before, like I help them. So I'm just like much more into it, into the categorization of the garbage. So I think that trust in the system is a really huge thing.
Interesting. And that gets into the whole manufacturing arena, right? Of what are the materials that we're even using to manufacture, and then ties into economics also, and poverty, and why are there people who need to subsist on recycling for income? So that comes back to this idea of like all these systems are interconnected, right? If we make a change in one area, all these things come along with it. So that's what we were hoping to get out of today, is start to see some of those connections, but also see like where is that point where you can make your contribution, because again, we need everybody to be working towards this common goal, and whatever it is that you feel like your contribution can be, or whatever your area of expertise is, whatever networks you have, we need everybody to be working on this together. I know that we probably could stay a bit longer to continue these conversations. And I think last week or 2 weeks ago in the first session, I encouraged you to use the private chat function to exchange contact information. If you met someone in your breakout room that you would like to stay in touch with, we're not going to be sharing everyone's contact information, but if you would like to send your email address or something to somebody that you worked with today, you can use the Zoom chat box and identify that person and just send them your contact. So I just wanted to end with this final thought. When we first thought about our visions of the future, I don't know what came to mind, but a lot of times people have this kind of dark vision of this dystopian vision of the future. And this is a reminder that the future does not have to be bleak. It hasn't happened yet. The future hasn't happened yet, right? So the continuing emergence of new thinking, innovative ways of living, and different means to connect people and nature are vital in overcoming critical local and global challenges that otherwise constrain sustainable Earth stewardship. So by focusing on positive, successful initiatives, rather than concentrating on potential negative changes that have not yet occurred, it can help sustain and amplify the efforts that already exist or desires people have for the future. So let's really focus on those positive changes that we can make and amplify those, rather than dwelling on a future that has not yet happened. So I will leave you with that. I don't know if you would like to stay on a little bit later for questions, we can do that. But I also want to make sure that if you are an educator, if you know educators, this whole series is based on a curriculum, a course that we've put together that's divided into these 3 different topics. First one is refueling the future, which we talked about in the first session. Today we talked about redesigning the future. And in 2 weeks, on October 30th, we're going to be talking about remobilizing the future, which focuses on policy and civics and where we can leverage the deepest change. So make sure that you download that curriculum and share it with any educators. And you don't have to be an educator. We talked about informal spaces and informal learning as well. These can be a starting point for community conversations like we're having today as well.
I
So,
think
yeah,
if I can
go ahead.
just
Yeah.
jump in for a second there. It's also, I mean, really try to share it with as many educators that you know. They were designed to be used as part of curriculums within public school systems that aren't necessarily project-based. They have all the embedded resources, so it's a very cost-effective curriculum to share. They're all lined with so many different standards out there. And the first one is really focusing on math and science. The second is a design and engineering type of bent. And then the third is about civics and policy. So depending on what type of teacher is interested, they can find something that they feel comfortable with.
Right, and then teachers can collaborate as well. That's the idea, is to think. A couple times we brought up this idea of like these silos of thinking, silos in between the different industries, and that's how our schools are divided, is into these different subjects. And so the idea behind this curriculum is to encourage collaboration among teachers who might not have the chance to, the English teacher who doesn't have a chance to talk to the science teacher. And so that's how it was designed. I know we're at time, and I know Mena has also offered to share what the GCE experience is like as a student. So if you need to sign off, you're welcome to sign off at this point, but I would love to hear from Mena if you'd like to share your experience.
You caught me answering someone in the chat. You would like to understand? Sure. Okay. So to me, the project-based learning and just the real world connections made everything a lot easier to understand. In my classes, there were a lot of different types of students. Kinetic learners, visual learners, hands-on learners. But I feel like everyone can learn a lot from hands-on learning, which is a lot of what GCE is, and a lot of just talking. A lot of days our class was just having a conversation, not unlike this one, and finding what we're interested in these topics. Someone can make an entire project on one thing they're passionate about, like sustainable fashion or sustainable transportation, and that allowance of freedom to explore what we're interested in while still focusing on important issues, I feel like is what makes the curriculum work best, because students are interested. And that's the one important thing teachers want. They want interest, they want passion in projects and such. And I feel like project-based learning, at least for me, it was the best way for me to learn, because I don't remember things by the test I took at the end of the class. I remember it because, oh yeah, I made a project on how much water I have to carry to and fro my house to the closest water source. I remember I did algebra while also measuring like the circumference of a neighborhood or something of the like. It's just a lot more memorable and honestly useful. Now that I'm in college, a lot of the people around me are not used to real world learning. And I feel like a lot of college is project-based as well. At least, I don't know if it's different in other schools. I go to an art school. But yeah, it's just been very beneficial for me to have that experience and that community learning and just the diversity at GC as well. Diversity is just very important in learning. I lived in a Hispanic neighborhood. I grew up with Hispanic kids. I didn't know anything outside of that bubble. And, different perspectives make you open your mind a lot and learn about a lot of different things. And I feel like it's important to teach kids that when they're younger, because, the prejudice hasn't really set into their minds and they're open to meeting new people.
Thanks so much, Mena.
No problem.
And again, I know that everybody, we're over time here, but I just wanted to give Erin a chance to respond as well, if you have anything to say from a teacher perspective.
So I can echo everything that Mena just said. I learn more myself whenever I'm teaching that way. Frankly, the best education is not having somebody who knows everything standing at the front of the room disseminating that information. The best way to learn is to try it out and to get feedback and then to try it again and keep doing that, failing upward, failing better. And I try to model that in my classroom as well. Of look, we're all going to try this together. We're all hopefully interested in the thing that we're learning, and we're going to keep pushing forward. And I see my role as just leading that charge. I'm a tour guide more than anything else.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy that everybody was able to join today. I hope that you had something tangible that you're able to take away from this conversation, whether it's, you know, the motivation to continue conversations or to share something that you learned today, or maybe you came up with an idea of how you could get involved with this movement towards sustainability. And I hope to see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.